Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Plaskin, and thank you, Representative French Hill, for the introduction. Representative Hill has been very engaged and concerned about the death of Bryan Malinowski and his district, and we really appreciate his help bringing attention to this tragedy. My name is Bud Cummins. I'm an attorney for Bryan Malinowski's family, and I'm a former United States attorney from the Eastern District of Arkansas. I want to tell you a little bit, Mr. Chairman, about Bryan Malinowski. Until 2 months ago, Bryan was the executive director of the Bill and Hillary Clinton National Airport in Little Rock. He was 53 years old. He and his wife, who's present with us today, Mayor, celebrated their 25th anniversary last December, and he had many, many good friends. He grew up in Pennsylvania with his brother and his two sisters, and he wanted to be a fighter pilot, but he didn't have the eyesight. So instead, he went and got his became a certified flight instructor, got a college degree, and went into the airport management industry. And he had several stops along the way in Pennsylvania, Florida, but in El Paso, Texas, is where he met his wife, Mayor, and as I said, they've been married 25 years. He found his way to Little Rock and eventually was named the executive director of our airport. By all accounts, he's very good in his profession. Our airport is one of, I think, 9, I've heard a few different numbers, less than 12 in the country that's debt-free. And that, I think, may be a concept that's strange here in Congress, but I think that represents some good management. Bryan was also a lifelong collector. As a child, he started collecting coins. He had various hobbies. He was that guy. I've been to their home and seen books this thick about coin collecting currencies, and about card playing. He studies card playing, and he tried his hand at competitive card tournaments. About 6 years ago, Bryan's father gave him his gun collection, and that sparked a collection interest in Bryan. And since then, he has become also a gun collector. And he found at gun shows, he found other people who shared his enthusiasm and his interest in not only guns, but in coins and other artifacts that you'll find at a gun show. He'd set up a table on weekends occasionally, and he'd display some of his guns, and he'd display his coins, and he would buy and sell and trade with other collectors. It is legal to buy and sell and trade firearms without a federal firearms license if you are a collector or a hobbyist. At some point, ATF suspected that Bryan Malinowski may have crossed a very murky line, and he was no longer a hobbyist. Because of that, ATF concluded that he was required to buy a $200 FFL, federal firearms license, before he sold any more guns. One thing is certain. His family and his friends and all his work colleagues would all guarantee you, if they were here today, that he loved his career and he loved being in the airport management business. And if anybody had ever suggested to him that his weekend hobby was in any way threatening that, he would have immediately been hands off. But nobody told him. Instead, ATF launched a criminal investigation into Bryan. They researched his background. They put a tracker on his car. They put tails on him and surveilled him. And soon they obtained a search warrant to search his home. By the time they obtained the warrant, they knew a lot about Bryan. They knew he worked in a secure environment at the airport. They knew he had lived a law-abiding life with absolutely no criminal history. And they knew he lived at home with his wife and his 2 dogs, and they kept a very regular schedule. Despite all this knowledge, ATF hatched a plan to execute the warrant by force. And on March 19th at 6:01 a.m., over 1 hour before sunup, 10 carloads of ATF agents and Little Rock Police Department officers came to the Malinowski home to execute the search warrant. They wore full tactical SWAT gear, and they approached the door at 6:02 and 46 seconds a.m. That's over an hour, about an hour and 15 minutes before sunup that day. They had a piece of tape ready, and they covered up his doorbell camera. So if he had time to wonder who was at the door, I think people get a doorbell camera to see who's at the front door, but they took away his ability to do that. Moments later, Mrs. Malinowski heard a loud crash as their front door caved in, and fearing for his wife's safety, Bryan jumped up at the sound of a crash, found a pistol, loaded a magazine in it, and left the bedroom to investigate. He warned his wife to stay behind him in the bedroom, but she stubbornly followed him through the doorway. It appears to us that ATF also killed the electricity to the home, making it difficult for Bryan to see in the pre-dawn hours. Mrs. Malinowski saw only darkness as she peered down towards the front entryway and could see shadowy outlines of presumed home invaders standing in her front hallway. That's what Bryan saw too. There was gunfire and Bryan was fatally wounded. His wife was standing just a few inches from him when he received a fatal wound to his head. We don't know all the details of what happened at the front door because they covered up the Ring camera and because they didn't wear body cameras in spite of a 3-year-old policy initiated by the President of the United States that mandated that they wear body cameras when executing search warrants. But we do know this. We know 57 seconds elapsed from the time they covered up the lens of the camera to the time Mr. Malinowski was dead. So something less than 57 seconds is the time it took them to knock, if they knocked, but we don't know if they knocked, force entry on the front door, and for Mr. Malinowski to emerge, to wake up, find a gun, and come to the bedroom. That means they couldn't have been at the front door more than 20 or 30 seconds. Although her husband had just been shot in the forehead right in front of her, the agents dragged Mrs. Malinowski into the front yard. She was barefoot, wearing minimal night clothing, and the temperature was 32 degrees. They locked her in the back seat of a car where she was detained for 4 or 5 hours. She begged to be allowed to check on her husband, but they refused those requests and kept her locked in the car in her nightgown. And she also had not been to the restroom yet since she'd just gotten out of bed, and they refused her request to go to the neighbors and use the restroom. And then finally, it took her to a nearby fire station, made her walk through in her night clothes in front of the firemen and use the restroom with a female police officer present in the room while she went to the restroom. Mrs. Malinowski does not have the answers to many of her questions, and there are a lot of questions. We give federal law enforcement awesome powers. We have given, and when I was United States Attorney, I was responsible for the use of those powers. But it's a huge problem if those powers fall into the wrong hands. I've been involved in public controversy for many years. I've never been involved in anything that more Kansans have come to me to express their concern. And they all ask the same question, why? And I don't have an answer for that. We don't have an answer to that question, and we hope this committee will pursue this and find the answer, why? And if there's not an answer, we hope that you'll find the problem and fix it. Thank you.
Thank